Welcome for the second session of today. We continue in our expert seminar in Between Eternity and Historicity. We will continue now exploring the after of Christianity with the next key lecture of Colby Dickinson. Colby Dickinson is an associate professor of theology at the Loyola University Chicago, so welcome here. And he will talk about poverty of history and poverty of theology.
My paper, as Martin was saying about his, my paper was actually much longer than the time I have, so I've had to edit it somewhat. I apologize if I leave out some key details that my respondents will speak to, but I'm going to take a gamble. It's just too long to read. So I'm actually starting a little bit into the paper, the second section. And I'll be talking about, a number of issues. And some of these relate to some of the themes that Martin was actually speaking about, because we're trying to circulate around this after of Christianity and what that is historically. Paul Ricoeur turns to the causes of what we experience as the fragility of identity within specific instances of manipulated memory in his Memory, History, and Forgetting, listing the heritage of founding violence as being perhaps foremost among them, as he renders things while also thereby giving us a general sense of the divisiveness of such acts involving the commemoration of violence. Quote, "It is a fact that there is no historical community that has not arisen out of what can be termed an original relation to war. What we celebrate under the heading of founding events are essentially violent acts legitimated after the fact by a precarious state of right. Acts legitimated at the limit by their very antiquity, by their age. The same events are thus found to signify glory for some, humiliation for others. To their celebration on the one hand corresponds their execration on the other. It is in this way that real and symbolic wounds are stored in the archives of collected memory." End quote. The state of right that Ricoeur speaks of is, of course, the legitimating principle of a national communal identity, one shrouded in the founding violence that it has made justifiable through the official declaration, implementation, and the apparent sacred duty of war. Despite the all too obvious reality that every act of war, when read from the perspective of the war's end, inherently divides those locked in competition into camps reserved for those who experience the glory of victory and those the humiliation of loss, war itself is endlessly commemorated as a self-legitimating act that becomes embedded in the archives of collective memory, which are themselves preserved through memorial sites, museums, educational curricula, and so forth. Quote, "A history taught, a history learned, but also a history celebrated. To this forced memorization are added the customary commemorations. A formidable pact is concluded in this way between remembrance, memorization, and commemoration." End quote. The all-pervasive ideological narratives of a given community are, quote, "thus placed in the service of the circumscription of the identity defining the community," end quote. Ricoeur's analysis in the context of memory, I would suggest, overlaps in a significant way with Regner General's insights about violence and memory and community identity, but also with Ricoeur's commentary on acts of what he calls monumental history in the third volume of his Time and Narrative. By pointing toward this specific linkage to monumental history and to Girard's work on violence and community identity, I want to demonstrate how an alternative account of history, what Ricoeur calls a critical history, may be the only way for something like a genuinely sacred history as a potential iconoclasm within history to be communicated. Now, Ricoeur's discussion of monumental and critical histories takes place in the context of Nietzsche's second untimely meditation on history, which would divide history up into its antiquarian, monumental, and critical phases, each seemingly in need of the other to provide a comprehensive portrait of human historical understanding. Monumental history, as the name implies, depends upon the insistence of an apparently timeless reflection on the greatness of certain persons, or you could say events, within history. Those whose fame has resulted in the construction of mausoleums to house them. Such a history has a certain overlap, Ricoeur notes, with Gadamer's sense of the classical, a concept that is also central to the theologian David Tracy's eventual articulation of the analogical imagination in light of the canonical developments of classical texts, an insight I'll return to shortly. At the same time, however, Ricoeur is also somewhat critical of these analogical methods that he detects at work in monumental histories. And he's critical of it in light of the tasks that monumental history seemingly places before itself. Quote, "The secret vice of monumental history is that it misleads through the force of analogy, by the very fact that it equalizes differences and disperses disparities, leaving only the effect in itself, which is never imitable, ones such as are celebrated by our great holidays. In this effacing of singularity, the past itself suffers damage." End quote. The caution we are issued in this regard is that a form of history that wishes to commemorate certain historical acts by turning them into something like a timeless monument to particular persons, events, or acts within a given cultural memory must level the differences or anomalies that do exist between the monument being remembered or conserved and the actually existing historical figure or event, which is never as neatly presented in history as its memory or as the monuments we make of it. This effacing of the singularity of the person or event is actually accomplished by the act of analogizing, and as such it misleads us, Ricoeur says, in positing a more accurate historical memory, something which can never actually be achieved once and for all. And of course, if we try to be so nuanced and diverse, we could never get there. It'd be like a Sartre's multi-volume biography of Flaubert, right? Ricoeur's reading of Nietzsche's critique of monumental history as pointing a way toward the necessity for a critical form of history that probes deeper into the reality of any singularity, any person or event, aids both thinkers in developing a position for historical accounts to deal with the necessity of forgetting, what Ricoeur will call a happy memory that must forget things in order to function in the present. This runs counter to the processes of monumental history, which analogously brings the past, and I would add the word sublimely here, and I'll come back to this notion of the sublime, but which analogously brings the past sublimely into the present to legitimate certain political goals and foundations. Such a contrast goes a long way toward explaining not only his development of a critical history, but also why Ricoeur maintains reservations about the use of analogy in general in his study, The Rule of Metaphor. In short, and as it takes up the issue in this context, the dialectic between poetry, and I would argue as manifest in something like the sublime, so this dialectic between poetry and speculative thought is really a playing out of another tension, one that is very close to René Girard's heart as well. Quote, "Between the experience of belonging as a whole and the power of distanciation that opens up the space of the speculative thought." End quote. In this tension, we have opened up for ourselves the nature of political discourse as rooted in something like a sublime object we recall from the past that can be utilized for political ends, what Slavoj Žižek has called the sublime object of ideology. Again, what is made clear is that the division between thought and something like a sublime feeling is one that opens up a political field of tensions and therefore of one element trying to subordinate the other within the dualism they inhabit, and which constitutes the field of relations, of representations that make up the sphere of the political. We find this same insight, though in slightly different form, in Nietzsche's reading of history as a tension between the strong and the weak. We see it as well in Jean-François Lyotard's discussion of the victim within the différent, or two meaningful phrases locked in an unresolvable dispute. It's on these grounds of tension and domination of history and its memory that Ricoeur critiques those traditional arguments for the analogy of being, for the analogia entis, which attempts to create a science of theology and hence sever theological reflection from the poetic altogether, likewise denying any dialectical tension that gives rise to metaphorical thought in the first place and creates an ontotheology in its stead. By refusing metaphor, those searching for an ever stricter definition of the analogy of being, he claims, are not only missing out on the legitimate role of the poetic, or you could say the sublime, within thought, but are working at a remove from the tensional truths that govern thought on the whole. They are perhaps even inserting a false form of the sublime encounter within a matrix of representations that relies upon a past point of origin to legitimate present political relations. And this is the mythological relation to the past in some way I was referring to earlier. Perhaps it could be argued that Ricoeur is missing out on the fullness of those possibilities for understanding the processes of analogy that brings us specifically in the sense we find to something like John Milbank's reading of the analogy of being, a Thomistic version of a mediating analogy that can account for both difference and similarity. Or maybe something like David Tracy's preservation of the analogical imagination as a play between analogy and negative dialectics. To preserve the utility of analogical reasoning, and despite its tendency to monumentalize history, is to hold out a chance for an aesthetic encounter with the beautiful and not just the sublime. A point that Hans Urs von Balthasar and his theological aesthetics, alongside his defense of an analogy of being and a negative dialectics, that might preserve too, though von Balthasar does not say this. And it might preserve the relationship between the beautiful and the sublime. Negative dialectics, which maintains a desire to go beyond, metaphorically, whatever identities seem to bind us through a negation of the first categorical negation that established representational identity in the first place, provides the permanent critique to analogical reasoning that can only be complemented by the way in which analogical thought provides a concrete platform for a shared understanding that a purely negative dialectics cannot. And to quote from Tracy, quote, "Without the ever-renewed power of the negative, all analogical concepts eventually collapse into a false harmony, the brittle sterility, the cheap grace of an all-too-canny univocity, or an unreal compromise pleasing no one who understands the real issues. Without the similarities produced through differences and negations, without the continuities, the order and even the possible actual or proleptic harmony produced by an internal theological demand for some new mode of analogical language, negative dialectics, left to itself, eventually explodes its energies into rage or dissipates them into despair. For alone, a theological negative dialectics leads into the uncanny whirlpool of the chaos of pure equivocity, a chaos whose own uncanny fascinans et tremendum power must one day discover that its own radicality and liberating power is ultimately empowered by, because rooted in, the same reality as its analogical counterparts, the always already, not yet event of the yes disclosed in the grace of Jesus Christ." End of quote. So for Tracy, it is precisely this unfolding of an analogical imagination, one that is forged in the back and forth between a negative dialectical and analogical methods of reasoning, that parallels the critical and monumental histories that Ricoeur had already detected at work in our representational logics. And it's this that we might also locate as the outworking of something like grace in all of its creative fullness, as a shuttling back and forth between the sublime and reason, the poetic and speculative thought, the divine perchance and the human. So just real quick to clarify, because I don't want to lose people, though maybe I already have. The negative dialectic is something analogous to the critical history, as Ricoeur calls this, and the analogical is something like a monumentalizing of history. And they have to ceaselessly be in a tension between the two of them. That's how we function, he says, historically. So this experience of something like a grace in this tension is precisely what becomes apparent to us in the ongoing and unceasing dialectic between critique and the monumentalizing of the event of Jesus Christ, as Tracy will put it. To what degree grace can be experienced as a form of critique of an already established monumental history is precisely what theology must be seen to perpetually explore, what Nietzsche had perhaps drawn close to but recoiled from, and what Ricoeur seems much more willing to circumscribe as the defining biblical expression that theologians are continuously called up to take and champion in whatever context they find themselves. Perhaps such an act of critique has the chance to become something like what Miroslav Volf has described as a perfect love, that he says is the goal of memory. The point at which memory is allowed to forget the wrongs that have been done to the innocent. Quote, a formation of the communion of love between all people, including victims and perpetrators, end quote. At the least, there arises in response to the existence of a monumental history the need for a critical history to appear, such that the injustice and unmercifulness of history can be exposed. For, in Nietzsche's words, every past is worth condemning. What Ricoeur is pointing us toward, I would suggest, is something like what he calls, quote, a certain iconoclasm directed against history, as sealed up in what is past and gone, but which he also says is a necessary condition for its ability to refigure time. It's for this very reason a movement against the monumentalizing of history, an almost, but I stress almost, antinomian gesture that can easily be mistaken as a heretical affront to the necessity for an analogical, even beautiful resonance that lies underneath any established communal identity. Its orientation toward the future, and not toward a point of origins, however, is what allows such gestures to be perceived as potentially antinomian, in that they do contest the mythology of legal foundations, though they also rely upon such foundations in another sense, for purposes of, we could say, shared intelligibility, language, law, and society, while also signaling a critique of them from beyond their focus on their origins. The question, however, of whether and to what degree the analogical leveling of differences within the singularity, or singular historical event or persons being monumentalized, is a form of violence needing to be removed, or at least rendered bloodless, as Derrida would have it. And this yet remains to be seen. At the least, we see the need for a critical history, much as Walter Benjamin had once deduced, to suspend the normative workings of history, to bring dialectics to a standstill, as he put it, and to champion the one-time losers of history, the oppressed and the marginalized, to have their voices heard, perhaps, for the first time. In Ricoeur's terms, quote, no doubt a time in suspension is required if our intentions directed at the future are to have the force to reactivate unaccomplished possibilities of the past, and if effective history is to be carried by still living traditions, end quote. We are returned here historically to something like Benjamin's weak messianic force, interrupting history in defense of those conquered by the monumental version of history, as well as to something like Giorgio Agamben's reading of St. Paul's thought, wherein the messianic, iconoclastic suspension of time itself becomes a proposition along the same trajectory of thought as Benjamin. This interpretive lineage that I'm following would make sense as well of Ricoeur's reading of memory, as he makes clear in a memorial address on the memory of suffering, as he called it, where he says it is precisely our recollection of the lamentations of innocent victims, such as those who died in the Shoah, that distinguishes the murderers, who are latent within a mythological narrative, we could say, from the innocent, which is revealed by the biblical words and actions. Quote, is it not the purpose of the archaic myths to explain how the whole of reality was brought into existence, and among other things, how evil started? Is it not the basic trend of all myths to look backward toward the immemorial past of the beginning, toward the time of the origin? End quote. So in contrast to an archaic mythology, the biblical narrative, and Ricoeur points this out, but this is very Girardian, if you're familiar with Girard's thought. The biblical narrative is one that promises a release from violent origins and the murders that linger there still. It is a pledge of fidelity to the innocent victims of a monumental history that is in need of revisiting in a more critical light. Now, following something like, let's say, Gianni Vattimo's reading of Girard's thesis as one that sees the narrative of secularization as emanating from this critical history of Christianity, the critical history that Christianity unleashes upon every monumental history that would masquerade as a sacred history. What is often called the mystical, even mythical origins of sovereign power. We might begin from this point to understand the instances of the genuinely sacred in our world as predominantly critical in nature. That is, to see the sacred as a force that exposes the violent foundations of a given normative order in order to condemn foundational mythological violence. In this reading, there may in fact be a way to read apparently secular critiques of the apparently sacred within our world as a manifestation of the sacred in some sense, or of this grace, no matter how iconoclastic or potentially antinomian such gestures may at first appear to be. What we witness through such understandings of memorialization and violence is a deepening of our experience of grace as a sort of lawless law, a forgotten memorial, or a memory of the forgotten. And this lawless law idea is exactly how Caputo refers to grace as a lawless law. But it's also how Kant defines the sublime. And I think it's an important piece and connection point here. In the search for a source that is not a commemoration of the violence that lies at the foundations of society, we are returned rather to a singular presence that can never be fully exposed or explored, but which nonetheless motivates our search for justice amongst those marginalized by a monumentalized history. The face of the individual before us who calls to us and prompts us to leave behind those monumental histories, in some sense to leave them behind, though never fully to really leave them behind, that have justified countless acts of oppression and domination. The singularity we can never describe but seek to approximate, and which escapes the narratives that monumental history provides for us, is the source we are really searching for, or the origins we are searching for. In this realization, we are likewise called to focus on the same object that Girard has been after, as has, I would say, Agamben in his study of the figure of the Homo Sacer, the fragile and unnecessarily sacrificed individual whose life needs to be preserved beyond the orders of this world. What we are left with is the ever-present push toward the effacement of a monumental history that's never going to completely leave us. A desire then for the poverty of a theology, not the eradication of a theology, or the idea itself arising as an abstraction from the material conditions of existence. Hence, its weakness to effect political change, but also paradoxically, its strength to provoke transformation and reform through clearing the space precisely for speculative thought or critique. We are desperately searching then for the idea that arises in religion to frame a relationship to the material reality, a defense via the idea itself of the alien, orphan, the widow, or the prostitute, among other marginalized persons, and contrary to the justifications of a more normative violence that works against such persons or groups. What we are after, perhaps, is the poverty of theology as the idea that takes us above the identities we are given by any social order, and which can never truly be defined or monumentalized once and for all. I would call this a negative dialectics, ceaselessly at work within any identity or idea, to be sure, but one that must always work, as Tracy pointed out to us, with its analogical counterpart, until the day should arrive when the analogical reduction no longer applies to the reality before us, something perhaps only possible on the day of a certain death, Christ's death, our death. The question I want to pursue very briefly or toward the end of my remarks is the question then of how the sublime or the divine, this lawless law, could be said to exist metaphysically beyond the confines of human experience. There is, of course, a great deal of lingering confusion in contemporary conversations on metaphysics as to whether we genuinely encounter a metaphysical reality when we simply go beyond reason or thought in what appears to be a hypernomian, or some would say apparently antinomian fashion. But perhaps also mistaking such experiences as being one with the divine when it is in fact an experience of being at the limits of experience itself. This was merely the threshold between thought and the sublime, with which Kant was well familiar. We're perhaps therefore justified in asking, with what ontological reality are we dealing when we contemplate this sublime possibility of grace, which need not be an instance of the divine actually entering our world, but may demonstrate itself as the boundary of human experience itself? Is it the reality of the divine or the reality of humanity seen from the edges of its own existence? Perhaps, as Lacoste has put it, we might find the divine within an experience of our own inexperience, manifest at the limits of our knowing anything at all, through what he calls a liturgical reduction of our being in the world. This approach admits the limits of human experience while also pointing toward the possibility of transformative encounter with the other precisely at these edges. Or as Jean-Luc Marion would have put it, there is perhaps something of the divine present within the excessively saturated phenomena that permeates our lived reality. For Marion, who is very clear on this point, the experience of the saturated phenomena is equivalent, and he says this, the saturated phenomena is equivalent to the experience of the Kantian sublime, or the Cartesian sense of the infinite, perhaps. Yet it is entirely in the material world, as much as our experience of such phenomena points also beyond our world at the same time. Of course, the sublime encounter, too, as Kant had himself understood, might be one as terrifying as greeting a horrific creature crawling out of a deep abyss. And as Richard Carney has noted, such an experience may be an encounter with a monster as likely as it may be with an angel. To produce a possible critique of the sublime as an encounter with something not inherently divine is to wonder, too, if this further demythologization and demystification of the possibility of the divine, or the God who may be, in Carney's language, yet contains any ontological or metaphysical presuppositions that might benefit a theological reading of the sublime as a possible moment of something like a genuine grace within our experience. Though there is cause to critique the limits of human experience as not necessarily sites of encountering the divine, it would be an overly hasty conclusion to admit that no such encounters were at least possible within these experiences. Pushed to the limits, human experience of the sublime would seem to be the locus of a potentially transformative encounter that contains the possibilities of rendering our present identities null and void, offering instead an alternative reading of the present and of presence itself then. Such an admittance does not solve the larger question, however. Is there a theological grace latent within the sublime encounter that is a disruption of our world and of our histories from beyond it? Or is it a purely human grace that we experience without having its source within ourselves? That is, do we contain the source of our own disruption? And is this what we might call grace? Further, might we consider whether or not these two things are structurally analogous to one another, though entirely separate in terms of their ontological status, or two sides of the same hyperbolic metaphorical experience? For Kant, of course, the link between the sublime and the divine was direct enough for him to attempt to posit a proof of God's existence through recourse to our experience of the teleological ends of the sublime. In the wake of such a proof's unlikelihood to convince potential believers through the incomplete reasoning of analogy, however, what are we yet to make in the end of the ontological reality of something like a sublime experience in relation to both the limits of language and of our understanding of the divine? Will an analogy of being, the traditional support for belief in the divine, be all that we can rely upon to make such a connection? Or will there be something within the linguistic nature of metaphor itself that will nonetheless continue to point to the divine through the fissures and paradoxes that inhabit language? Lyotard once contemplated how the impasse between thought and feeling, the différend of feeling as he put it, was one that seemingly called into existence the appearance of the sublime as one way to engage and describe this impasse. Reaching the limits of thought is thereby where one encounters the sublime, where feeling attempts to present what is unpresentable to thought, but which is yet entirely immanent to our world. This dynamic and utterly human experience is where we discover that the divine is perhaps not encountered in the translation from feelings to thoughts, but rather what is most pronounced in such an experience is the mystery that human beings are to themselves. The différend is an interesting and important conceptualization here in what I'm trying to work through in these relations, because it brings together the sublime with the metaphorical nature of language. And there I think it joins with what Ricoeur is trying to do in relation to history. In essence, a différend is a conflict wherein different regimes of language are represented, creating a situation where there can be no immediate resolution, or what Lyotard calls a litigation, according to the impasse that frames the conflict, but which also cannot resolve it. Both sides in the différend are unable to refer to the rules of their own language in order to achieve justice within a given situation. And so the true victim within the conflict ultimately cannot give voice to their status as victim. That is, there may be a ruling or judgment rendered that does not take into account the language or discourse of the victim, thereby silencing their protests altogether. The différend accordingly presents us with the double bind of both being and not being something at the same time, the very definition of metaphor, according to Ricoeur. And I'm trying to do something here that's, to put this in the context of how I'm framing this as a larger project, I'm asking very simple theological questions that get very complex very quickly. But why, for example, in the terrain of a field I work in, political theology, why is there this permanent impasse, let's say, between the communitarians like Stanley Hauerwas and Alistair McIntyre and John Milbank and the radically orthodox, who depend upon an analogy of being to posit their sense of identity? And we could critique that and say it's a very monumentalized vision of Christianity. And on the other hand, the genealogists, right, who are very engaged in a permanent, almost antinomian deconstruction of whatever structure is given to us. Why are we always caught in this différend between these two discourses that can never recognize the victim of whatever discourse they've structured? So I'm trying to address something like that dynamic through these dimensions. Lyotard's account of the différend between thought and feeling as two different discourses that often results in feelings being subordinated to thought, rationality, reason, and order, allows us to see not only the political dynamics latent within each cultural or linguistic clash of civilizations or of theologies, but also to note the political elements locatable within the experience of the sublime. The sublime signals that an impossible situation is happening, as Lyotard put it, insofar as the sublime, via the imagination, posits an encounter with a presence that cannot actually be presented to the understanding. In such a situation, one discourse attempts to dominate over another, exposing the feeling of the sublime as an opaque legitimation for its dominance, or, we could say as modernity might have shown, reason dominates over feeling, which cannot produce an object for reason to inspect. As we know politically, reference to a sublime origin of political ideology can easily become the foundation for sovereign rule, just as reason, for its part, attempts to govern the liberalism implicit in modern democratic forms. Ontological discussions of the sublime are therefore a simultaneous entrance into the discourses of political theology, I would argue, and this brings Carl Schmitt's critique of liberalism but defense of sovereignty, I think, into this discussion of Lyotard's relation of thought to feeling, interestingly. We might look in this instance to specific readings of metaphor that take account of its sublime ontological properties, especially insofar as they are politically, socially, and religiously determinate. That is, how they appear to overcome their fictive as-if nature in order to provoke reality to be otherwise than it is currently configured. There is no doubt that the power of the Kantian as-if was quickly demythologized by a modern critique of its of its stance. I lost my place. Fictive stance vis-a-vis being, its non-ontological nature. Okay. Kant's distinction between the as-if, which was the domain of representation, and the as-such, the presentation of the thing itself, of the phenomenal object before our eyes, gave rise to numerous philosophical modern quests to discern the true nature of the objects we perceive without presupposition, most notably in phenomenological terms. It's also true, however, that reality is shaped through the coincidence of invention and discovery as they converge within the poetic feeling, as Ricoeur once described this state of reality in making his insistence on the rule of metaphor. Exploring the ontological commitment of poetic speech as the way through which we encounter an ecstatic experience of language in its appearing to go beyond itself, Ricoeur did not hesitate to pronounce how there may yet be something like a metaphor faith beyond demythologization, or in the terms he was to develop perhaps more in depth, a second naivete beyond iconoclasm. Metaphor, then, as with the sublime, could be seen as providing the shape by which we begin to understand how humanity can go beyond the clash of images and words that typically define our representational world, opening us up to something beyond ourselves, even metaphysically, perhaps. The use of analogy, which seeks a somewhat direct access to the transcendent, he deduces, is not on par with that of metaphor, which retains both the is and the is not within the linkages it posits, establishing thereby the sense that it generates a going beyond, a meta, that implicates metaphysics as much as it does language. Analogy rather seems to reinscribe the identities of the two terms at an ontological level in terms of their essence. The quality of metaphor in both being and not being something is what will lead Ricoeur to define metaphor in relation to Aristotle's distinction between actuality and potentiality, or being and not being, or the polysemy of being that discloses the poetic as situated entirely on the level of being. Again, by drawing our attention to the relationship between metaphor and the split in being between actuality and potentiality. Ricoeur signals the presence of the political theological element within language and the conflict of discourses. As Agamben has made abundantly clear as well, the division between actuality and potentiality, which is embedded dualistically in political discourses in terms of auctoritas and potestas, undergirds Western politics on the whole, as well as theological discourse of God's being. The critique of analogy offered through an invocation of the sublime is brought to a head theologically in Lawrence Paul Hemming's contention that the sublime does not have to point to an encounter with God, which would actually be a reductionistic view of a God who must surely transcend whatever we take the sublime to be. The infinite cannot be brought into the finite through either analogy or sublimity, here understood as metaphor or metaphoricity. By devaluing both approaches, Hemming is able to conceive of the sublime rather as, quote, a name for transcendence as such, and is bound up with an act of negating whatever identity we posit as a unified essence. This is also, as I am here arguing, the very idea of metaphor. The analogy of being had previously served to suture together a series of temporalities, the past and the present, that cannot really be brought into a final or lasting harmony, a point that modernity's conception of the sublime had only temporarily delayed unveiling. Hence, Hemming can conclude that, quote, with the death of God and the bringing to a close of the divine end of sublimity comes the end of the operative force of the analogia entis, which proved to be the product of an impasse, a solution to the divergent temporalities of man, of God, and world, end quote. By positing the sublime as both something to be overcome, but also as the negating force of identity, Hemming defines the sublime as an act of transcendence in the realm of metaphor, while also negating it as a specific ontological site of encounter with the divine in the realm of analogy. The establishment of metaphor as a process of both abstracting and concretizing within a historically given cultural linguistic context brings Ricoeur to the point of forming a hermeneutics that takes the metaphorical qualities of ontology seriously. Hermeneutics, the unending task of making an interpretation while simultaneously being caught up in a clash of interpretations, is one that is founded upon the ability of the imagination to go beyond the limits of our understanding, a task that Ricoeur grasps through Kant's development of this dynamic in his third critique. In so many words, he considers, quote, but where the understanding fails, imagination still has the power of presenting the idea, end quote. This basic insight is what will allow Ricoeur to conclude that speculative discourse, quote, bases its work upon the dynamism of metaphorical utterance, which it construes according to its own sphere of meaning, end quote. There is in this power a hidden dialectic between belonging and distanciation that allows speculative thought to appear in the first place. There is also a dialectic between the understanding, posited through analogous reasoning, and the imagination, determined as metaphorical thought, one that we cannot escape, though we may emphasize one side perhaps to the detriment of the other. Trying to legitimate God's existence or to comprehend it based solely on analogy, then, is to miss the larger dialectic and to perhaps also do a reductionistic disservice to the divine. And I would only add, and to simply see it as a negative procedure alone, as a negative dialectic, is to miss the fact that we do exist in real worlds and communities with political ends, etc., etc. Thank you very much.